Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. So we'll move to the next presentation. It's from Professor Julian Elliott. He's the head of the Living Evidence Consortium in Australia, and that's why he cannot be with us physically, but he recorded the meeting just a while ago. That's recorded. So he has tremendous experience with us and with other partners in the Living Evidence. He's really one of the first promoters of the idea when it was not so intuitive that it was the way forward, and now we are doing it. So he's sharing some thoughts with you today. Are we able to show the recording?
I think they are.
Okay.
I think I'll take this one.
Okay, there we are.
Which I'll be talking about a bit more today. My work is based in Australia, with the University of Australia, and infectious diseases, and co-founded the Cochrane non-profit platform for systematic review. So this model of clinical practice guideline should be well known to everyone. We assemble multidisciplinary teams to create systematic reviews to feed that into a team that is tasked with developing a clinical practice plan, both with the aim of improving decisions for clinical care against healthcare. The five strengths of this model over time and resource intensity is very difficult to collect a analysis of study and to keep it up to date with the following research. We have this progress between currency of the process, and there's this tension between these two that we've been tackling for several years. So, following initial work some years ago, developing the living systematic review model, to developing the model. So, effectively, this is distinct from conventional uptake, whereas conventional uptake until someone with one in the council to the guideline. The guideline is then time, and then with the research the guideline actually becomes like therefore activate the system until at some point in time a decision is made to update. We have to climb often just as much work as the initial guideline development. In contrast, a living guideline, there is no escaping initial need and constant initial up-to-date on one topic based on. But then from that point onwards, we enter these very tight, rapid, and frequent cycles of searching for evidence, incorporating the information into being able to update our evidence profiles and if appropriate, update recommendations. And so in this way, we can maintain the guideline in a more up-to-date state over time. So it's not no effort, it is certainly effort, but that effort is more evenly distributed over time. And through that, we create this product and create guidelines that are trustworthy and up to date with the latest research. So now about almost 4 years ago, we formed this Living Evidence Consortium to really build on the work that we've been doing in these reviews and start to tackle what we thought was the next frontier criteria, which was the development of housing. This is a direct of organization being classified areas in Australia. And through that project, we initiated a project. The first was the national stroke awareness, which became really the first national awareness. I think one that was and stroke continues for over 2 years, and I think is really so much for this father. In that period of time, there's been a number of updates, which have included really important developments, including stroke. So these are meaningful updates to the guidelines. They're not just minor tweaks. What we've found through that process also is that it's actually quite feasible to maintain in that living state, walking across the plateau. So, for example, you can see in this data over million times through training alpha and aspects of about 16 hours per month, so certainly quite feasible. Also, to some research on how these guidelines sleep users. And so you can see here that there's a perception of an increase in likelihood of following, frequency of access, likelihood of access, and importantly, trust. And then we get translated through to the actual use of the guideline. So you can see here in this period, the conventional updating mode of updating once every several years, there's a fairly constant level of access to the guidelines. But as we started to update them frequently because of that major alignment updates, the amount of use of the guideline measured through access and through the website was more than 3 times the slide. So quite good, but was a process that the guideline was getting much more value just tomorrow. On the strike, we moved to establishing social liabilities and turns out across projects, including one that we've been doing for a large network process with many of the members of the magic team. That's been a great. The work of course is question, and this example to conference to write also giving guidance of those questions that not us at all groups. One of the importances of the living guidelines is that it is being constantly with the users to encourage traditional submit their questions to the others. Let's those questions that will shape the of the so those are the first to address. We have to think of the group. What's the actual question we can explore and just put much more that. That then goes through to our structured UK question, and use that to identify research literature, researching which then using the development of evidence profiles, and those evidence profiles and implementations to expert clinical panels, we have 7 standing panels, and also an additional group of experts that we can provide with very specialised expertise. Supporting those groups, we also have an independent conflict of interest committee, which is ensuring direct design governance of the task force itself. Those panels may review which then do a context of the program, which provides the strategy for the review and the support of the mission. The aspect action forward. In going forward, we then have the interaction with government for jurisdictional liaison for important quality of their recommendations, asking the government if there are important issues regarding implementation that we should take into account before we finalise a recommendation. That then goes through to our steering committee. The steering committee is really instrument the correct process as we run, but not clinical experts. Our representatives of about 100 organisations within now 32 investment organisations constitute the task force partnership. And each week, when we update the guidelines, asking each of those 32 organisations to sign off on the recommendations before we then publish. Once we publish, we're looking at a number of mechanisms to disseminate provisions around Australia, through visual social media, etc. And then, of course, once the recommendations are made, we can maintain that by continuing that identify the recommendation outcome. I just want to mention a few of the components through the task force. So first of all, I mentioned the task force of concept of cohesive organisations. And for me, it's really brilliant was the fact that the convention of high quality guideline is partnership. That's the partnerships of these stakeholders that we naturally critical and that we've got very strong unified voice, and really the full weight of the key bodies behind our recommendations, which really provides an incredible sense of confidence and engagement for clinicians. So that work of nurturing, enriching the partnerships with our stakeholders is at least as important as all of the evidence work that we do. Typically, our clinicians, we have up to 200 clinicians, is for the first year of studies, but we meet every week to review and update our guideline recommendations. And of course, I'm incredibly grateful for those contributions. I think our learning of clinicians are able to maintain the engagement of the key guidelines. Anecdotally, in some of the classes that we uptake that we've done, clinicians have indicated that our highly valued price. We are aware of this, that we really not contributing to to a guideline that then goes out and they're very willing to continue to contribute to a guideline in order to maintain that in an up-to-date state. And I think this continue to contribute to clinical studies. Thirdly, in terms of communicating more widely to the general public, social to try to become that trusted press. I think that's some success on that front. This is not to say, of course, that all the coverage has been positive. At the time, the great controversy around is being followed by criticism of response. I think the point I would want to make is that we need, I think, as a guideline community and as commissioners to recognise that we live in a world now where algorithms need to be fragmented. And I think we need to be more engaged with those communities that are disengaged from public institutions, who have a mistrust of the system, and we really work much harder on specific initiatives to engage with those communities. In terms of policing and enforcement, we continue to monitor the uptake platform and that progress usage data. Also in some of the research that we've done, we've been discussing conditions, one of the most important activities, all of the platforms that have been developed. And you can see here the most important element of the city was the content. The other point I would make is that people often wonder whether funding is not very frequently we can use condition in very frequent changes. Again, the concept is that the goal is that in any conditions we think about equally transparency, that only it's up to date. I expect you to try and focus on that. I know that that is how it's because all of the things that are always they want to stay there and incorporate the guideline. We also, I think, bring about working in government and we should develop a working relationship, but at the same time, of course, emphasizing the independence of the guidelines that we produce. More recently, we've worked very closely with our regulatory agency in our technology assessment such that we're able to access individual documents from sponsors, clinical study reports, and that's been extremely helpful. But just to note that there are always challenges in managing relationships with government. But I think government is also having different models that are responsive to the important methods to impact on policy makers as they occur, so that they have a government who can be responsive to those particular challenges. I'll just mention very briefly in terms of tracking what impact our recommendations are having on actual practice in patient outcomes. In Australia, unfortunately, we have quite a fragmented health data landscape, and so we can only able to measure concordance between the recommendations and practice. This is one example of the powerful methods using in Australian ICUs. And it's really intensively communicating very strong data systems, and that's a great opportunity for us to practice. The other example has been primary care with the understanding of that, but it's really relatively forced and for example, use of steroids in primary care to reduce presentations for other conditions. You can see that we have very long increased use of ivermectin for some data from primary care. So just To summarize, I think we have through the last years been able to demonstrate that there's additional progress that it is possible to develop guidelines that are trustworthy and up to date. And this graphic gives you some example. So this is looking at green research and treatment of COVID-19. The green are publications of randomized controlled trial data, and the blue are systematic reviews. So first of all, you can see that number of conventional systematic reviews is now, as in many other topics, is outnumbering the number of randomized controlled trials. This is then looking at the duration for which those systematic reviews were accurate. Half of the systematic reviews were current data the day they were published, and the other half had median time to become effect of 17 days. So this was a completely inadequate mechanism for keeping up to date with the research as it emerged. With guidelines that we were able to keep up to date, the time and publication we data to keep updated was 14 days. So it is limited. And this, of course, is in part because we're publishing for the website, not for which internal, but there's ultimately more steps in the publication process. So in closing, I'll just refer to paying partners and funders, but of course, all of the individuals who contributed to the task force and what we are going to do is our own project for the last few years. I think probably all of the those that continue to contribute to all different. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. I'll share your applause with Julian. You can see he's a great optimist, relentless optimistic, and we are really happy to be working with him. He alluded to our collaboration with Magic, so you can see how the Magic app can actually be used by different partners in creating content, even in a similar condition. And we met this morning with different stakeholders to see how we could maybe increase the collaboration. So I'm glad we were able, even through recording, to share this with you. Apologies for the people on Zoom. We are aware there was a problem with sound. We don't exactly know why, but we hope it was still, you still got some of the messages. Maybe we can disseminate the presentation afterwards. We can find a way to have it through. I'd like to move to the next presenter, which is Professor Gillian Leng. Maybe you can start preparing the, Gillian will be sharing slides correctly. Yeah, Julian Leng is the CEO at NICE in the UK, who is also conducting prominent work on living evidence, living guidance in the field, and a long partner with Magic. Gillian, we are looking forward to your talk.
Thanks very much. I'm just trying to get the slides appropriately for you to see. What can you see a full screen slide or just a part screen slide at the moment?
It's part screen now.
Part screen. I had trouble with this yesterday in terms of making it full screen. Let's try this.
That should work.
That should work. Is that better, or have you got?
We got it.
You got it, and you've just got one slide, not two. Right. Okay. Let's crack on. So. Thank you for inviting me to talk to you about our strategy at NICE, as well as how we've used the Magic app over the past year. So here's a slide that we've used to introduce our strategy, and I'm aiming to cover that first, and then some more detail about the Magic app. But when we were producing our strategy, which was quite a challenge because we were doing that at the beginning of the pandemic, so things weren't quite as we had expected, we talked to opinion leaders from around the world to see what was changing across the system. And these were the key things that we identified and that then fed into our strategy. I'm not going to go to lots of detail in this slide, but the rapid pace of innovation in health technologies, we heard loud and clear. And the increasing use of data, real world evidence, digital products, all of that was really important to people, and we felt we needed to take that into account in our future HTA work as well as in our guideline development. So lots and lots changing, I think, was what we saw. And of course, that all became much more dramatic as the course of the pandemic wore on. The strategy that some of you may have seen has 4 key pillars. And we wanted to keep it simple. We wanted to keep it something we could remember. Pillar 1 around rapid, robust technology evaluation. I'm not going to say any more about that, but I do want to obviously focus on pillar 2, dynamic living guideline recommendations. I'll say a bit about pillar 3, having effective guidance uptake to maximize our impact. And pillar 4 is underpinning all of that, really, leadership in data research and science. So living guidelines. I started at NICE back in 2001, and it wasn't long before people were talking to me then about how quickly should we keep guidelines up to date. And there were people talking about living guidelines then, 20 years ago, but in general, it all seemed too difficult. It seemed too difficult to do in terms of being a guideline developer, but it also seemed too difficult to do if you were somebody implementing a guideline. People said to us, hey, you know, we just about managed to put your guideline into practice over 2 or 3 years. Please don't keep changing them because we'll never be able to keep up. And I think it's interesting to reflect that world 20 years ago because it clearly has changed. And what we heard when we were talking to people about the strategy was an expectation that guidelines should be up to date. People use digital interfaces, they use technology to access recommendations, and they expect them to be up to date. So we really had to take that on board in our new strategy. But to do that, we also need a new guideline structure that will make it easier for us to keep up to date, but also make it easier for users to find the underpinning evidence. And to do all of that, we need flexible, rapid methods so we can pick up on the key questions and that need to be answered, and also address feedback and inequalities. Inequalities was in here because of what people experienced during the pandemic. And this slide highlights on the right some of the early priorities in taking that forwards. It's not going to be an overnight change from the 400-ish guidelines that we currently have to having a set of living guidelines. And the first part of doing that will be focusing that guideline portfolio into some core topic areas, those core topics that we can keep up to date. And we need that new digital guidelines platform, one of our early priorities to put that in place, new mechanisms to gather feedback. And then, you know, our guidelines manual, all of us working in the guidelines world, we write down how we do our work, and we need to make sure all of this is included in our manual. And just one slide on the pillar 3 of our strategy, because it's very linked to the living guidelines. And we particularly want to make sure that the second bullet here is in place, improving digital access to NICE guidelines, to make it easier to find the recommendations through a range of routes, because we know that some people will come to the NICE website, but some people will want to use an interface that they might have in their hospital or their GP surgery, or indeed there might be third-party providers of evidence-based services that should be able to easily take the recommendations from NICE and embed them in their own front-facing products. There's obviously lots of other things we need to do to maximize our impact, not least tracking how people are using the recommendations. And we think getting this whole thing more digital will help us to have a feedback loop and find out how much the recommendations have been used. So the pandemic. I started my time as chief executive at NICE on the 1st of April. So just after the UK had gone into lockdown. It was an interesting time, and NICE was asked to respond to the pandemic by producing some rapid guidelines. And our normal timescale for producing a guideline is 1 to 2 years, usually closer to the 2 years than the 1 year, it has to be said. That wasn't going to work for the pandemic, so we rapidly developed some interim methods and processes, put together a cross-specialty group, and managed to develop guidelines in 5 to 10 days, as did lots of other people around the world. We were all pulling together to try and do this very quickly. And in the end, we produced 25 rapid guidelines. And because these were very much a prototype of having a living guideline, we have done over 100 updates to these guidelines since they were published. A great way of working internationally, collaborating on that new evidence and demonstrating how we can keep guidelines up to date. And we also did a guideline on the long-term effects of COVID-19. That wasn't one of the first things we were asked to do, as you might imagine, but it probably is going to be one of the ones with the longest impact, unfortunately. So why did we decide to test some of these COVID-19 guidelines on the Magic app? Well, you probably worked out by some of the things I've been saying about needing to have a living approach, keeping them up to date. That speed that we needed to be following to develop and update the guidelines meant that using Magic app was going to really help us with the product. We had a lot of people working with us at any one time, an internal team, external people, and we needed to integrate things from other guidelines too developed elsewhere. So there were lots of challenges that we had, and we really felt that Magic app was going to be a good solution for all of these challenges. And the benefits were, as you guys all know, I probably don't need to tell you, it really helped with the continuous updating. It made it easier to work together. So there's different groups that I described. Creating the evidence and the grade tables was much simpler. There was less admin work and a central version control. So in this pretty intense hothouse environment of doing these rapid guidelines, it gave us a really good solution. And we didn't do all our 25 rapid guidelines in Magic app because we'd started some of this work beforehand. But we brought a number of the rapid guidelines together around managing COVID-19 in Magic app, as well as the one about managing the long-term effects of COVID-19 or long COVID, and a more recent guideline on vaccine-induced immune thrombocytopenia and thrombosis. So we've got those 3 living guidelines in the Magic app. One of the really useful functions of using Magic app was the remote decision-making approach. Everybody was virtual at this point, so NICE's traditional bringing everybody into a room around a committee table wasn't going to work. And therefore, having all the virtual panel members made it much more straightforward. There was more time at the panel meetings to actually have a discussion around the tricky issues, and it gave the NICE team additional flexibility with their timing. So overall, this gave us more efficiencies and more time in the living guideline process. So everybody was really grateful for this approach. And just reiterating some of the benefits, thinking about the topics that we did, the development time for the vaccine-induced thrombocytopenia and thrombosis guideline, we developed and published that in 2 months. Developing and synthesizing data, using them in the managing COVID-19 guideline, the collaboration around Magic app enabled faster publication and speed of updates. So lots of benefits. I think you had a workshop this morning with the team, and hopefully they emphasized some of these points about how useful it was in this scenario. So this is particularly the example around COVID, of course, but you have to think back to our strategy and what we're going to need to do, and we need to reflect on all these benefits. We also looked at what users thought, because of course users of NICE guidelines are not familiar with coming to the NICE website and finding guidelines in this format. So we wanted to get some feedback, because of course we need to think about what should we do in the future. We gave a demonstration of MagicApp, you might be interested to know, to the NICE board. We've got quite a new board of non-executives at the moment, and they thought this was really good, really clever, really easy to use. So that was very positive. The feedback that you see on this slide came from over 100 users of NICE guidelines, and they were mostly from healthcare, frontline professionals. So this is what they thought, and it might be feedback that you've already had from other quarters, but I thought it was worth just showing it now. The main positive things that people felt about this presentation was the menu on the left, the clear, succinct recommendations, and of course NICE recommendations can be quite long, so clearly people appreciated these being clear and short, and they liked the layering of information and the layering of evidence, and that's something that NICE has been aiming to do for a long time, that ability to drill down to the evidence. So really good to get that positive feedback from our audiences. In terms of areas of improvement on the right, you might be able to tell me that some of these things are being looked at already, but what we heard was that people didn't find it necessarily easy to identify updates. It wasn't easy to find other tools and resources, and sometimes the product wasn't as quick, as speedy as it should have been. And then there was some mixed feedback about how it was pulling COVID content together, some queries about the strength of recommendations, and information for specific groups and settings. Now that bit about strength of recommendations is probably something that's specific to NICE, because many moons ago we removed from our recommendations any grading around strength of the evidence or strength of the recommendations for various reasons. I won't go into now, but it was taken away. So it's interesting that it's had mixed feedback. So some people will have liked it and clearly some others won't. So this is my final slide, and just to tell you what we're going to do next, because we've obviously got to move forwards with our strategy, of which Living Guidelines is a key plank, and we want to take forward the learning and the experience that we've got from using MagicApp. And then we need to think about our existing guideline portfolio. And it's, as I said, it's a massive portfolio at the moment. We need to rationalize that, and we need to think about whether all of that is going to be applied to a living model, or whether we have to rationalize it in some way and prioritize the types of recommendations that in future will work in a living model. And all of this, the aim is to have guideline recommendations that are useful, usable and used, and aligned to our users' needs. Those words, the director of our guidelines program, Paul Crisp, that you might know, uses a lot. Guidelines that are useful, usable and used. And finally, we want to make sure the underpinning evidence for those recommendations is there in a way that can help shared decision making. So it's particularly important in the UK context, supporting clinicians to have conversations with patients, and we want to make sure they can access that underpinning evidence. So as a summary, lots and lots of positive learning, lots of great experience with the MagicApp, and we'll have to come back and follow up this conversation around what we do next. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take a few questions if there's time.
Thank you, Gillian. Thank you very much. We're a bit delayed with time, but It'd be good if you have 1 or 2 questions to share with Gillian before we move to our next presenter. We hope to have the session finished in about, I would say, 2:45, 2:40, 3. It's already 3. Why
Yeah,
is it,
it's not correct.
Oh, it's not correct. 10 minutes wrong. Any questions for Gillian? Thank you for your feedback on the use. We're looking forward to dive into it. And you could all see how different users experience the fact that you can structure the data and the process in different ways. Okay, there don't seem to be any further questions.
Fine.
Thank you again, Julian.
Okay, bye.
Thank you. I'm introducing now Dr. Janet Diaz, who is the lead of the clinical team for COVID-19 response at WHO, has been central in providing WHO guidance for COVID-19. And we've been very fortunate to work with her and her team over the last year and a half now. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you. It's a privilege to be here. I appreciate the invitation for Magic. It's my first time in Norway, so I took the invitation once we were allowed to travel. I was like, yes, I will come and see what Norway is like. So even though I'll be here for 3 days, it's a privilege to be here and also to be at this hospital. I was touched by the story at the beginning, so thank you for introducing the hospital to me. And it also reminded me of the hospital where I trained and worked earlier on in my career, which was the public hospital in San Francisco. So San Francisco General Hospital, which serves a similar community. So I'm happy to be here. So on behalf of WHO, I'm going to present a little bit about our experience writing living guidelines for COVID-19. And in that, maybe echo some of the previous speakers' points and also highlight some of the work with Magic. So let's see. What can I say? We have developed our therapeutics living guideline using Magic app and in collaboration with the Magic team as our methodological support team. And with that, we have had, thank you, the following. So 6 updates since the September 2020 to September 2021. We've had 6 updates of our therapeutics guideline. And so I just want to preface, I'm going to speak about the therapeutics as the example, but we actually have a comprehensive clinical management guideline as well. That's also published in the Magic app. We have recommendations for 7 drugs, and we do publication in 3 simultaneous platforms. One is the WHO platform, which is on the right there, which is our PDF. The PDF actually is made automatically from the Magic app publication platform that's in the middle. And on the left, we have a collaboration with BMJ where we publish our living guidelines, as has already been discussed. So this all you can find on our website. As you've heard before, traditionally living guidelines, clinical guidelines, especially at WHO, have taken quite a bit of time to develop. In the past, they may have taken 1, 2, 3, potentially 5 years to go through that long process. And as colleagues already explained, then that can, by the time like the guideline gets out, it already needs to be updated and is outdated. So we obviously could not do that for COVID-19. So we needed to be nimble, flexible, at the same time, transparent and trustworthy. And so right now we have a timeline of 8 to 10 weeks from full data availability to guideline publication. And here I've simplified in 5 steps the way we approach this, but I do this because I have to present on a regular basis how we're writing our guidelines in a very complex scientific environment and a lot of stakeholders that are pending to hear what WHO is going to say about certain drugs. So step 1, we have a therapeutic steering committee. I just wanted to describe that for you. That means we have WHO staff. We have 6 regional offices scattered around the world. We have staff members at each regional office represented in our therapeutic steering group. We have multiple departments across WHO. I'm in the health emergencies program, so I do outbreak response work, but we have the group that works on medicinal health products, pre-qualification, essential medication list, maternal child health, so many different stakeholders around WHO, and we convene them as a therapeutic steering committee. There's probably about 25 members of that, more or less. Step 2 is meta-analysis and grade. As you guys already know, you've heard, we have 2 main systematic reviews that we use to inform our guidelines. One is a living network meta-analysis from colleagues at McMaster's, and the other is a prospective meta-analysis approach, which I'll discuss briefly in the next few slides. We have a guideline development group. That's a standing group of international experts in clinical medicine. As WHO, we provide public goods for our member states. So it is important at a global level that we have representation from all regions of the world. So you'll see in our guideline development group, we have clinicians from every region representing different specialties, similar to how the colleague from Australia was describing different specialties represented, different temporary advisors come in if we need a certain high-level specialty advice into the guideline development group. We have 4 patient panel members that participate in the guideline development group. We have an ethicist who's part of the group. And so in total, we have about 40 members. Not all of them attend all the meetings, but we do have a kind of a standing panel approach so that we can convene on a regular basis to review evidence and prioritize PICOs, et cetera. Recommendation writing, the guideline development group is the writing panel for the recommendation. So WHO doesn't write the recommendation, it's the guideline development group that writes the recommendation for us. That recommendation is drafted and then reviewed. We have a series of external reviewers, as well as external peer reviewers, I guess is a better description. Those are usually implementation partners or people who are in the field using the guidelines. We are using actually a couple of NGOs that are working in some of the more limited resource settings to be reviewers for us. We have a guideline review committee, which is also a combination of WHO staff that's not involved in the guideline development process, as well as external experts. And then it goes through that review process, and then finally publication, of which I've already described to you some of the publication platforms we are using. But if you can see I'm trying to make a new slide and I haven't succeeded yet in how I wanted to look at, but I wanted to show the complexity of this. So the 5 steps actually requires a massive amount of coordination. So if you look here now, we have the steering committee, which I described. We have the meta-analysis team and the LNMA team from McMaster's. I don't know how many people they have, maybe 40, 50 people as an example. The method support team, which is the MAGIC support team that we're collaborating with as well, has many people. How many people? 10. I'm going to do the guideline development group already has about 40 people. The guideline review committee probably has around another 10 people, the external peer reviews. And so as you can start to see, there's a lot of stakeholders and collaborators that are necessary in order to make this happen. And then when we go to publication, we have a WHO website team, all this stuff happening at the WHO. We have a communications group. So all those things about communication, what the Director General will say at a press conference to what we will tweet at WHO to what we will do on LinkedIn. And then of course, the collaboration with BMJ to get the guideline into the public space. This is a highly complex process that we've had to coordinate. And so I just say project management is essential to make this happen. Our evidence synthesis, we learned, obviously need to be updated on a living approach. There was no other alternative, right? We needed to be living and we couldn't rely on things that were stagnant. And so there we have the living network meta-analysis that I think Thomas showed on the left. So then again, that being one of our primary sources of evidence synthesis for our guidelines. And then 2 examples of JAMA articles on prospective meta-analysis technique that we used to look at the evidence for corticosteroids and IL-6 receptor blockers. And that was important for us to do because there were so many ongoing clinical trials and we wanted to be able to synthesize evidence before the publications were even in preprint. And so the novel approach we took to do that was to do a prospective analysis working with the clinical trialists in order to get better timelines on when data would be available so then we can synthesize evidence faster. So what did we learn? A lot of preprints. So before COVID-19, we didn't write guidelines on preprints as far as I know. We waited for peer review, we waited for someone else to take a look and say it was a good trial, but now that's no longer the case. So we do trust preprints and that's, with its own risks, I guess. We do get data shared with us before publication, even before preprints. So WHO does engage through confidentiality agreements with trialists and also with pharmaceutical companies when we know that there's data available. They haven't yet put it into the public space, but they have full study results. And so we have a collaboration that way in order to get the data, of which then we can share in confidence to the meta-analysis team in order to start the evidence synthesis. And but just to note here, even if we get data before it's in the public space, by the time the guideline gets published, we do expect that data at least be in preprint so that anyone who's using our guideline can reference the primary data source in trial. So the formatting of my slides got a little bit confused. So there's many things we have learned. So I think with each drug, even though we tried to make this as process-oriented and as methodologically rigorous, which we have, but that has allowed us actually to learn new things with each drug that we've evaluated in the process. And I just want to highlight some examples because I think it's interesting. Methodological considerations, we always go back to the values and preferences. Do we need to relook at this for every new drug? And it's important, right? Because you're making judgments, recommendations based on values and preferences. Rethinking outcome prioritization. What's important at this point for the severe patient? What's important for the mild patient? So in order to have an eye, whether or not we need to adjust. Calculating baseline risks over time. This has been a good, important learning, right? Like what was the baseline risk of an outcome of mortality at the beginning of the pandemic in those first the big corticosteroid recovery trial versus what is it now? And then looking at results from platform trials. So we all acknowledge that, the platform trial approach has been an incredible advancement in science and research and the ability to test multiple interventions at a large scale. But at the same time, it has complexities as to when you want to include that into the systematic review to make sure that you have the right numbers of who's being compared to who, because it changes over time in those studies. Mechanistic considerations. So we do spend time thinking about mechanisms as well, especially for these novel drugs. And I raise this now because of the new news about the two new investigational oral antivirals. But we need to look at safety profiles, which we do as adverse events that are reported in clinical trials, but not everything is reported in clinical trials. Especially for the newer drugs, we don't know that perhaps there may be theoretical risks that can be seen and not measured yet in clinical trials. How about resistance, the issue of resistance? How about dose response, variability of dosing, PK data? When we looked at ivermectin, I remember many discussions there because there were so many different doses of ivermectin being used in those trials. So it was a little bit messy to try to sort that through in order to do a proper analysis. And so we spent quite a bit of time discussing those things. Clinical considerations, pre-specifying if drugs can be part of a class effect. We learned that when we looked at the IL-6 receptor blockers. Is it going to be sarilumab and tocilizumab, or are we going to look at them separate? Same discussion for the JAK inhibitors. Pre-specify, are the drugs going to be working together, or are there going to be alternatives? What is our hypothesis? And then the subgroup effects. At the beginning, we were looking at all patients, and we still do look at all patients, but knowing that some patients, some drugs are going to be more effective earlier on in the disease, and others potentially later on in the disease, and that has panned out with the immunomodulatory effects in the severe critical and the antiviral potential impacts in the less severe. Oops. So just an example here. In the context of WHO, I do want you to see kind of the complexities of which we're working under. The press release by Merck caused a lot of stir at the WHO, as it has in the media, a lot of buying of member states of this drug, a lot of when is WHO going to write a recommendation. So that obviously, we had already been in discussions to receive that data and also data from 3 other trials that were ongoing in India. And we did, and just putting some dates here, on the first, that was the press release. On the 22nd, we held our GDG. We received on the 5th of November the trial data from a total of 4 trials, and now it's going under meta-analysis for a meeting that we hope we can have by the 8th of December. At the same time, we're dealing with access. So I don't deal with the access issues, but my colleagues at a different department deal with access, pre-qualification, regulatory issues, and that has to go in parallel. Because in the case that we do write a recommendation for this new drug, that pathway has to be in place for member states. We also, other colleagues at WHO, working with companies to create equitable access to medicines in low, middle income countries, pharmacovigilance teams to put into plans, pharmacovigilance programs for countries if we were to introduce a new drug. And then at the bottom, you can see the community and the hospital, but this is the development of tools for frontline workers, communication messages for stakeholders, donors, member states, and communication products for community members, patients, and families. The last 2 slides, I think. So going back, so where do we publish our guidelines? Again, here's just a little look at our guidelines. If you go to our website, you can click on this link, and that will actually link you into the Magic app, and then you can see the Magic app recommendation. To the left, you can see the infographic that was already shown, and to the right, another type of infographic to support clinical use. I actually like the Magic app myself. I think it's nice the way the end user experience of it, and the way you're able to show what may be perceived as complex concepts, such as relative effects and absolute effects and baseline risk in a simplified way. And I think we do need to make that an important message on how to, train clinicians around the world on how to use evidence-based medicine, and potentially with these sorts of infographics and these sorts of messages, we can start to share that information and that approach. We also have a series of other dissemination products, a toolkit, which will have administration materials in it, and as well as a course online, which is called Open WHO, that will discuss therapeutics, that hopefully will publish before the end of the year. My simple conclusions, I do think living guidelines are here to stay. I think we've learned a tremendous amount in this process, and I really emphasizing that the ecosystem is complex, but with transparent and trustworthy processes, there is space for agility, flexibility, without compromising quality. And I think that's what brought us together with the colleagues at Magic, where I think we fundamentally believe in that thing, that we can do this, that we can be agile, we can be partners, but we believe in quality, right? But it does, so, and the final comment is just tremendous collaboration. I'm very grateful for all the partnerships we've made directly with everyone who's involved in the guideline, as well as with all the people that are depending on this guideline or waiting for this guideline, and all the member states that we hope do find value in the guideline and work to implement. I didn't say a phrase here about implementation, and this I think will be the core piece of work that we try to advance on next year, is actually adaptation at national levels, because we haven't measured it in a very scientific way at WHO, and implementation. So we look forward to that sort of work, and thank you.
Okay, so I need to beg you to stay a bit beyond 3 p.m. if you can. There is food and drinks in Villa Viken. So if you are very thirsty or hungry, please go there at 3 p.m. But I'm sorry about the delay here, but we do want to have a discussion with you in the end to bring up some key issues that have come up. And I think I would like to invite some of you to comment, and you need to come up here and speak into the mic. So Tone Ikdal, the director first at the local level, what could this mean for you after this potential overload of information? I hope you still are able to keep your brain cold enough. And then I'll have some others to come in, but you could also raise your hands and we'll take questions. Tone, what do you think?
Well, thank you everyone for a very exciting afternoon. And thank you, Janet, for sharing the exciting story about how WHO were developing the living guidelines on COVID-19. I mean, we have all been following this story in the newspapers and in our medical discussions, so that was very, very, very fascinating. And it is fascinating for us to see that you could use this Magic app in that way, and that it works, that it really works. I think that's a way of showing the relevance. I myself, I'm a medical oncologist, and I believe that medical oncology is a field where we have been developing medicine very evidence-based through the last 20, 30 years. We are doing randomized trials, we are reading each other's randomized trials, and then we are updating our guidelines perhaps once a year, best twice a year. I mean, Norwegian Breast Cancer Group, they are very good, they do at least twice a year, and we consider that good. But I think when we are living now with this enormous number of new studies in every field, it's really a challenge to be updated. And also, I mean, everyone are so busy. So I think that we really need some useful tools to be able to implement new knowledge consequently. And I think that for us in this general local hospital, I think it will be very exciting to be a part of this, to try to use this new way of working to on a daily basis, knowing that we have updated guidelines in some of the areas that we work. So I really look forward to what is going to come, and we're so glad to have the Magic Group at Lovisenberg. I think that's what I was going to say. Yes, thank you.
So we still have Jill on the call, and there's a question for you, Jill, on how do you deal with cost effectiveness in your guidelines. Do you want to briefly comment on this before we take the next comment here?
Yeah, thanks, Per, because I will have to leave shortly, so I'll answer this if I can, and happy to take any other questions before I have to go. It's a very good question, because when we used Magic App for the COVID guidelines, we didn't include cost effectiveness, so that made it much more straightforward. I think it's one of those areas that we'll need to look at as we take it forwards, and to see how we can use it, what flexibility there is. If you remember when I did the presentation, I said we might have to prioritize some recommendations and some types of recommendations. We don't use cost effectiveness on every single guideline recommendation by any stretch of the imagination. It's only some. So it's a good question, and it's one that we've got under review.
Thank you, and we have discussed this also with WHO in Australia lately, so it's really a common challenge. Now, I want to invite Jon Henrik Låke to come to the floor. He's an intensivist. He's one of the few people in Norway who's worked